My son likes to leave the room when I start things with the phrase, "when I was a kid." I think back to Thanksgiving up in northern Michigan. And my father had a grocery store, and it was along the highway on the outskirts of town. And one of our frequent customers, probably if I added up all the money they spent in our store, it would equate my college education, was a family called the Stones. And the Stones lived out by the dump, a little bit farther on the outskirts of town. And they were a Native American family. And we started our service today with songs and readings from the Native American tradition. And it's almost impossible to think of Thanksgiving and not remember that for many people in our country, it's a national day of mourning of all that was taken from them. That the return for their generosity on those cold New England days was to lose their land. So that when I was a kid, in my hometown, the Native American families that I knew had the worst land. And my sister used to tease me and say that I looked like a stone because I had dark hair and actually was a little bit darker than Terry Stone, who was in my class. And that was kind of an insult because back in those days, people hid their Native American heritage. I don't know if I have any Native American heritage. People often ask me. My grandmother would say, well, you had an uncle my grandfather was French-Canadian, which might have been code word, but we don't know. And because it was one of those things, it was before the time that being Native came in fashion for white folks. But that connection to the Native Americans can never be forgotten. And whenever we are connected to the land and the food we eat, potatoes come from this country. Tomatoes. I don't know what the Irish and the Italians ate before people came to this country and brought those plants back to Europe. So much of who we are, so much of what we eat on Thanksgiving. And one of my favorite things on Thanksgiving was the squash. And my mother and my grandmother would make acorn squash, and they'd bake it, and it'd have this real rough green husk, and you'd have to take a spoon, and it'd be a bit stringy, but they'd smother it with so much butter. And you could almost eat anything. It has that much butter on it. And we would get together as a family. Sometimes at my grandmother's house, and sometimes at our house if our country cousins joined us. See, we were city folk. We were in the county seat. We had the county stoplight. We were sophisticates. But my dad's brother lived south of us by about 30 miles and out in the country, and he had a farm and a root cellar, and they would can, and they would have all sorts of things that they would bring, and if Uncle Francis got lucky, well, he always got lucky getting several deer, but if he didn't sell them all to people downstate, so they'd have a deer to take down with him, we'd have venison, which was the meat of the original Thanksgiving. They didn't raise the turkeys as wonderful fat birds back then. They got the wild game that was in the land and the venison. And it was a time for us to be together, and a time to share our differences and bump up into each other. One particular Thanksgiving, Uncle Francis and his family were joining us, and when the mashed potatoes came around, and Uncle Francis's family, he was the patriarch, the rule was that he took half of the bowl of potatoes, and the rest of the family shared. And after he took the half bowl, he went to my grandfather, who also had the same tradition, took half of the potatoes, and my mother's face went pale and said, "Well, there are no more potatoes." And then I think of a Thanksgiving, probably about 18 years ago. My grandmother was 90, and I was bringing my new wife up to Rogers City. And Gail went to the store, and someone said, "Oh, you must be Mrs. Davis." And she said, "How do they know?" And I said, "Well, you are probably the first black person in town in about 6 months, and I imagine the rumor has gotten around." And I had heard from my sister that my grandmother said, she goes, I know I shouldn't feel bad, but I do, and I'm ashamed of myself for feeling a little bit nervous about this. But Gail will tell you that my grandmother treated her with nothing but graciousness. And we bought Christmas presents. We were coming up for Thanksgiving, but we weren't going to be able to make it up for Christmas. And Grandma looked at the box and said, "Well, I know this is chocolate, because at 90 years old, I don't really like much else." And also at 90 years old, I'm not going to wait to Christmas to open it. It's that joy of eating chocolates with my grandmother, who died the next summer. It's one of the last Thanksgivings I had with her. And knowing that all that baggage that I grew up with about suspicion, about people who might be a little bit darker than blonde, was getting better. And it continues to get better. But it only gets better if we're intentional about it, if we look at our own selves of places where we need to expand our Thanksgiving table. The Native Americans could serve as a warning for us that they were not rewarded well for their graciousness. And we carry the burden of our ancestors' mistakes. But the best way to go forth into the future is with that same generosity of welcoming people to the table, welcoming them to be a part of our congregation, of our community, of our world. When we give thanks, let us give thanks to all. Amen.